It's Chris. Glad you could join me. A couple days ago, got a chance, a bit of a unique one, and this is, I don't usually do a lot of swarm stuff. I mean, we do some, but not a lot. But this one was a bit unique. One of the Manitoba Hydro transfer stations, I guess, had a swarm move in onto one of the switches that they were about to work on. It was a new setup. They're doing some changing of transformers and stuff like that in there, as far as if I remember right. But anyways, got the chance to go in there and get a swarm. And so we took some photos, got a little bit of video, and ended up with more stuff than I needed to have. So I'm going to try and make this succinct, and I'm also going to put chapters in. So if you want to just skip ahead to where the swarm is or that type of stuff, you want to jump around, you can do that. Feel free to just skip to the parts you want to see. But first off, it gives me a chance to talk about what a swarm is. There's a bit of a misconception, even among some beekeepers, that a swarm is actually a bad thing, that a swarm is something has gone wrong with a hive, that there is a problem or a disease or this type of stuff. And that's not normally the case. Usually when a hive leaves or when the bees leave a hive because there's disease or that type of thing, I would call it an absconsion. That means that the bees have just left. They've gone to find other hives and this type of stuff because there's either a disease there or they know the queen is no good or this type of thing. So they've absconded. They just leave, and then you end up with an empty box for the most part. A swarm is actually a sort of an instinctive natural progression for a healthy hive. If you think of a hive rather as a single-celled organism, so that you have a single-celled organism, basically once it has the resources within its body to split into two, it does that. And that's sort of what a hive does. When they grow as a hive and they have enough brood and they have enough feed resources within their hive body, within the supers and that type of stuff, then they split. And the way they do that is by sometimes the queen is part of it. Sometimes they do it on their own. Bees will move eggs around and put them into queen cells and that type of stuff when needed. Weirdest thing I've ever seen is one hive stealing an egg from another hive to make a queen cell. What they'll do is they'll create a number of queen cells, and we can tell usually when it's a swarm coming is because all the queen cells, or majority of them, will be on the bottoms of the frames. When they're doing it because the queen is old and they need to replace her, they'll do them right up on top of the frames. But when they're swarming, then they'll put them on the bottom, and they'll lay sometimes 10, 15 of the queens. Sometimes there's only 3 or 4 of them, but they'll have these cells in there. And a few days before those cells are about to hatch, then they'll basically herd the queen out and take the queen, and sometimes she's with them, sometimes she's they'll even chase her around to make her lose weight so she can fly. But basically they herd her out, and then they take off as a group, and usually, hopefully, preferably, it's half of the hive approximately that takes off, and then they leave the honey and the nectar and the pollen and the brood that's there. They leave it behind for the new queens to take over, and it's usually about 7 days or so, and then these new queens, they hatch. The first thing that these queens do when they hatch is they'll go and they'll start stinging all the other queens in the cells if they can catch them, and if they find another queen in there, they'll fight to the death kind of thing. So it's a bit of a queen melee going on inside the hive, and that's one of the reasons why they want to leave with the mother queen before that happens, is because then she will actually become part of that battle. There are the odd times when you'll have multiple queens in a hive, but that's not normal. So in order to keep these hives and to split them into 2, like your one-celled organism, then they take off with the queen and they'll go find a spot to sit. And basically they'll just find a nearby spot where they can sit down, and then they plunk themselves there and send out scouts, and then these scouts will go try and find a good location, a hollow in a tree, a hole in a house that they can get into that has enough space for them to build a hive, that kind of thing. And then within 48 hours typically, they'll take off and they'll be gone. So that's sort of what we're harnessing as beekeepers, is that drive to fill up their space so that they can split. So as long as they're trying to fill their space, we can take the honey away, and they'll just keep refilling it and refilling it and refilling it. And so we're trying to keep them from swarming by taking the resources away from them and that sort of thing. So that's the excess honey, and we leave the pollen behind and that type of thing so that the brood can keep growing, so that the hive is still healthy, but we do take the excess honey. So in our area in Manitoba, at least, and probably across the prairies, we get a lot of canola honey, and canola honey is not a good honey for winter, because canola honey will granulate so hard and into such dry crystals that it takes a lot of resources from the bees to reconstitute that into a feed that they can digest. So it's actually harmful for bees. We've seen bees die because they had too much canola honey in the hive. So that's one of the reasons why we'll take the canola honey out and replace it with sugar syrup that they turn into a honey that basically remains a liquid throughout the winter. So is it ideal? It may not be quite as nutritious as the honey is, but it does require less resources from the bees for them to actually use it as honey and over the winter, and that is better than them starving or dying because they used up too much of their body resources to turn this granulated canola back into honey. So, not being mean, we're actually trying to help them, and they're helping us at the same time. So we're just trying to work with their natural instincts to build that size into swarm. We often, actually, when they get to that size, we'll often split them ourselves by taking half of the bees, and sometimes the brood and basically the nest. We'll just split it in half, put a new queen into the one half, leave the old queen in the other half, and then we've got 2 hives. So again, we're just using their natural instinctive desire to grow and to fill their space for our own benefits, and just trying to keep it controlled. Feral bees, that's basically what a swarm becomes, is a feral hive. And they can be fine. They may not bother anybody, but they often end up in people's homes and that type of stuff, or they end up on a hydro switch like this one that we're talking about here. So anyways, I'll show you some pictures, and then we'll get into what was going on with this swarm. So this is kind of what we typically see from swarms. They're just bees hanging in a tree, and we have different methods of getting them out of trees. Some of them are more fun, and there's another video coming up here that you'll be able to watch, and they'll even sit on things like our bear fencers. So when they do get that desire to go, it's sort of wherever that the queen, if the queen starts petering out and doesn't have the energy to go further, they'll sit on whatever they can sit on. But typically they will find a tree or something that they can sit on that is better for them. So this hive, Don, the gentleman from Hydro, called me the night before and said that this hive, the swarm, had landed on here. And so as soon as I saw this photo from Don, I was like, okay, so this is one of 2 options. One is fairly normal and one is fairly rare. But the normal one is that this swarm is too large to stay in a cluster on that switch. And so a number of them have fallen to the ground. And then because it's cooler, they'll just stay in that cluster on the ground, and then every now and then they'll try and fly up and join. But basically you'll end up with 2 clusters, and they'll just stay that way until it's time for them to leave. The downside for swarms like this, when they do separate, is that when those bees take off to swarm, it's sort of a pheromone thing. Like bees communicate mostly by pheromones, and you might have seen dancing and that kind of stuff with bees. And so there are different methods they do communicate with, but pheromones is one of the main ones. So when this group takes off, hopefully the ones below that notice that they're taking off and they join them, but they don't always. And we left this one overnight to see if they would leave, and by morning then give me a call if they haven't. And Dawn sent me a picture in the morning and that said, there's still some bees left. So normally, if this is a single hive, and there is a slim possibility that you'll see sometimes 2 swarms that will gather together like this, and there'll be a cluster on the top, there'll be a cluster on the bottom, and those are 2 separate swarms. And it's just because that swarming instinct got going, and they were 2 hives are swarming at the same time, and they kind of got mixed up in the air and just went together. And then when the queens landed, they kind of just jumped on each other, on each of the queens, and then there's 2 of them in the same location. I was assuming that this was probably just a cluster that had fallen off from the original swarm and was now lying on the ground. And when the bugle call went in the morning, or whenever it went for the swarm to leave, and those pheromones went out, this group missed it. But there's a gentleman, and this is about 8 feet away from where they're working, that was allergic to bees, and he was going to be working on the switch. They needed to get to this switch, so they needed these bees gone. So I went down and took a look at them, and got to wear a really cool Hydro hard hat here for a bit. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm just trying to look through the cluster and just kind of pick through if there's any thick spots in this cluster of bees, if there's any chance that I can see the queen in there, if they still have a queen. And I did not. I could not find any place where they had a queen. So I had brought a box along, a super or a hive body, with a few frames in it, just to try and, if a need be, to get the bees into that box. So just putting the box down in front of the swarm, I opened up the lid, scooped some bees in by hand and just threw them in the top, and then put the lid back on. And those bees started fanning almost instantly to create, just for one, because again, pheromones, they're trying to now communicate with each other as to where they are and what's going on. And the smell of the wax and the frames just communicates to the rest of the bees that this is a safe and a healthy place for them to go. So in this video, you can see the bees basically from that fanning of the bees on top, that the bees start walking in, and we get to, I'll just pop open the lid here in a little bit, and you can see the bees inside fanning away, and they're just trying to regain that cluster pheromone smell of where they are. With the lid closed, most of that pheromone smell goes out the front of the box, so then the bees start going, oh hey, that's where the cluster is now, and they start working their way inside, and they'll start walking in. And it's a good opportunity to sit here and kind of watch for the queen to see if she walks across, assuming that I haven't scooped her in, if there is even a queen in here. So basically now the work is sort of done on some levels. We're just letting them climb into the box, and hopefully, you know, that they all move their way in there. So this is sort of, you know, a wait and see process, wait for half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that, just to let them acclimate to the box and to move in there as much as possible. As it's the least work for me, and it's also gentler for the bees. But they don't always go that quickly. So again, sometimes it's like the old physics thing: an object in motion wants to stay in motion, an object at rest wants to stay at rest, you know, that kind of stuff. So they're basically they're just sitting there, and a lot of them went in, not all of them. So trying to, you know, disturb the cluster of bees that were sitting there, and rather have them move into the box as well. And then of course I get smart and I try and pull some more off with my hand to move them in. And then I pay for it. That's just part of beekeeping. So after about 30 minutes, 45 minutes I think it was, I gave them some smoke to try and encourage them to move in. Again, just trying to disrupt the pheromone smell on the concrete, and rather have them moving into the good pheromone smell inside the box. So just trying to kind of disrupt where I don't want them and trying to encourage them to go where I do want them. And after that was done, and the majority of them were inside, I just took a piece of mesh that I had along and stapled it over the holes that were in the box and over the entrance to keep them indoors while we're transporting them back to the apiary. Then once that was done, it's just a matter of taking out the vacuum cleaner and sucking up the strays that were left over. And again, this is one of those where, you know, be prepared. And I came with the vacuum, but I forgot the battery. But thankfully, the crew there used Milwaukee M18s, the same as me. So they had a spare and they let me use it. So that was a good deal all around. So we managed to suck up most of the bees, probably, I think there was about a dozen left flying around. And then we took the bees back to the apiary, dropping them on the ground and just, you know, opening the vacuum cleaner. And there weren't that many bees in the vacuum, which, you know, makes sense. But I did put a net on just in case they were a bit crabby after the ride, and they weren't. They were fine. But the following day, about 24 hours later, give or take, I went and removed the screen. And the reason why we leave the screen on there for that amount of time is so that the bees cluster within that and sort of make it a home, so that they actually take it on as their home rather than just flying away. Because when you're doing this in the daylight, there's no reason for them to stay there unless, you know, I mean, there are times where they will just stay in the box, but they don't always. Sometimes they'll just fly away, and then you got an empty box. But so just leaving the screen on for 24 hours and the lid on just helps them to kind of stay home and get used to their new home. So coming back a couple days later, check on them. There were bees coming in with pollen. There were bees coming in, it looked like they were coming in like a normal bee flight, coming in from a hive into a normal hive. So that made me think that, well, maybe there was a queen. Maybe this was a duplicate swarm that was flying around with them. So further inspecting them, looking at the frames in the hive, I noticed that there were eggs in some of the frames, but I couldn't find a queen. And in these frames, I'll see if I can pause here someplace where we've got a close-up shot, but some of these frames have, you know, 3 or 4 eggs in them, and that usually means either a really bad queen, or more likely than not, a worker that has decided to take on the task of laying eggs and being the queen, which is kind of useless. See, a queen carries multiple thousands of sperm in I think it's called spermatheca, and so she's good for 3 or 4 years. She mates once at the beginning of her life and spends about a week doing that, and then she's good for the rest of her life. Doesn't have to get mated again. And a fertilized egg is what becomes a worker bee. An unfertilized egg becomes a drone. So that's how they happen. So a worker bee that is now laying eggs, those are all going to be unfertilized eggs, so they will all be drones. They cannot lay a fertilized egg. So there is no way, if you have worker bees, to create a queen or anything like that. So you can see, though, they were acting like a normal hive. They were working around. They had their brood. They were bringing in feed and pollen. So they were just going ahead like everything was fine and dandy. So they had created at least 3 queen cells for themselves to create a queen, which means they know that they don't have a queen, or they don't have a good queen. And one of these cells had 7 eggs in it, which is very abnormal. That's a highly abnormal thing, and again tells me that these are either really dumb bees, or they have a laying worker, and she's just laying eggs willy-nilly kind of thing. In any case, put this back on the chance that there was a queen in here. I just haven't seen her. And at this point we have a number of options. We can either try and find, keep looking for a queen, and if you can find one, then they have a queen. Or we could put a queen in, but if we do and they have a laying worker, more likely than not they'll just kill her. So you have to manipulate them into knowing that they don't have a queen and they want a queen. So there's various ways you can do that. You can shake the bees out across the yard and then let them come back. And while they do that, you can put a queen in. Sometimes you can spray peppermint or something in there just to disrupt the pheromones of the hive again, and then they may accept the queen. You can put in a queen cell, and they may accept the queen cell because they're already making queen cells. So you just have to get rid of the queen cells that they have, and then put a queen cell in, and then they may recognize it. So, but you need the queen cells on hand, and I don't know if we had any right on hand. Another option is that you can drop a frame of good brood in that has young larvae and eggs and that type of thing, and then let them do what they want to do, which is to create a queen cell, and then they can create an emergency queen cell out of those good eggs and larvae. So that is the option that we actually ended up going with, is putting that frame in there and seeing if they would create that. And coming back 7 days later, they had created queen cells. Unfortunately, they had laid eggs in them, and so they are basically doing the same thing again. They just allowed all of the brood that was there to mature past the point where they could make viable queens. They created new queen cells and laid more drone eggs into them. And checking the brood again afterwards after the 7 days to see whether or not they had made, if where they were at, pretty much all the brood in here that this worker had laid was drone. So we're pretty much at a point where this hive it's not going to be a hive. We can keep throwing things at it and try and make it into a hive, but we're getting to the point in the year where there's no way we're going to turn this 2 frames of bees into a colony that's going to survive the winter. So our options at this point are to basically allow them to live out their life and then pull the honey from it, or to take a piece of paper and put that on top of another hive and put these on and let the bees go and join them. That has some risks involved too, because whenever you're collecting a swarm, and this is one of the things with collecting swarms, especially into a commercial operation, why there's a risk and expense involved, is because we never know what this hive had. We don't know if it had diseases, we don't know if it had mites, we don't know if it was carrying American foul brood or anything else that could actually be very detrimental and costly to our own operation. So in some ways, if you're going to do this safely, you need to have an apiary that is completely isolated, that is by itself. You put the swarms in there, you go through the process of treating them and finding out if they're a healthy swarm before you move them into your regular apiaries and get them into honey production. So that's, maintaining a yard just for swarms adds to your cost. And then if you do have to treat, that adds to your cost. And, if it does bring a disease into your operation, that adds a cost. So for us, as commercial beekeepers, the cost to collecting swarms sometimes outweighs the value of getting them. Since, like I mentioned at the beginning, when we have good colonies, we can make the splits and nukes that we want and create more hives that way, which is probably a better method. There are a lot of people, though, that do collect swarms, and this is sort of their main line. This is what they do. They collect swarms, and then they take the time. It's like that's their shtick, I guess. In fact, there's some guys on YouTube. I think 628 Dirt Rooster. If you want to look that one up, that guy's does some interesting stuff. I think it's Randy McCaffrey, I think his name is. Anyways, he does some interesting stuff with catching swarms and cutouts, and there's a few others. Texas Bee Works. Anyways, dropping names. But you can look on YouTube if you want to find people who are catching swarms. If that interests you, then good deal. In any case, I think that's it for this little swarm, and thanks for watching. All right, take care.